Hey guys, Spencer Chauvin here with Chauvin Builders. I wanted to show you this house today. I saw it on Facebook the other day under the page Plantations and Manors. A person had posted this home. It was supposedly inspired by Oak Alley Plantation, and it was built just outside of New Orleans. They're listing it for sale, I think for 7.5 million, and it was originally built for 5.5 million some years back, and designed by an architectural designer in the Carolinas, I believe. And I was expressing some disappointment on the page in the fact that the home really missed an opportunity to exploit our southern Louisiana architecture and to also exploit the classical orders, which has sort of been forgotten today. And I made some suggestions, and the gentleman who made the post had asked if I could be more specific with some of the verbal constructiveness I had come across with, and I thought I would just do this video to show what some of the changes I talked about verbally would look like in an actual application. And the first thing that grabs your attention when you look at this building is that the roof looks really squatty and short. What makes this building difficult to do is that it's so wide. And you could have easily traced a picture of the real Oak Alley and just said, look, this is what I would do to make it look better. The problem with that is that the original Oak Alley, it's a fairly small building. It's only 50 feet wide. And this building looks closer to be around 70. So it's really not an apples to apples comparison when you look at the two. You can also see that the new building doesn't really look anything like the old Oak Alley, other than it has columns and 3 dormers. Now, to preface this, what makes this a little bit more challenging is to use the existing footprint and floor plan, and let's see if we can make it look more traditional from that perspective, rather than just saying, well, here's what Oak Alley looks like. And getting back to the roof, typically you see a very low-pitched roof when it's hidden behind an entablature like at Bocage or Ashland, Belle Helene, many other houses like that. And the height of this roof is really not conducive to the overall proportion of the building. This is a grand building. It's very wide. There's 12-foot ceilings, it looks to be, on the first floor. And you've got these huge bays here, and then this excessively flat roof. And it just jumped out at me as that could look a lot better. I think just by adding a little bit more of a pitch to the roof, you could make this building look 100% better. You have to be careful in these Greek Revival buildings not to go too steep and they start getting away from the style. The Greek Revival buildings had very low pitch roofs. Tezcuco had a 5-on-12, if I remember correctly. I'm not even sure what pitch this is, but the roof is more proportionate to the rest of the building in this particular case. And the next thing we did was we raised the chimneys. If you're going to raise the roof, you want to raise the chimneys proportionately. And one thing that a lot of builders and designers get wrong on old buildings is they make the chimneys too short. And it's a common mistake today. But the reality is most of these buildings many years ago had wood shingle roofs, and you had the massive fire in Chicago. I think you had 3 in New Orleans, and the buildings were catching on fire mostly from the embers coming out of the chimneys. And they started writing codes expressing that the chimneys be at least a minimum of 4 foot tall above whatever roof it was, so that by the time the embers came out, very red hot and fell to the roof, they had time to burn out. And so on all of your old buildings, you had very tall chimneys sticking out. Later on, a lot of these houses lost their tall chimneys. The gunboats from the Union ships would come down the river and target practice with them. I remember a story my dad heard from a woman who was 103 years old in like 1953. That would have put her back in the time of the Civil War. She said the worst part about the Civil War was that everyone froze to death. And because they couldn't light their chimneys, being they were too short after being destroyed by the soldiers, and that's what made life very difficult afterwards, the fact that no one had any heat. So anyway, the chimneys were extended here to be a little bit more proportionate with the roof. And the next thing we did was adjust the dormers slightly. These dormers were a good bit heavy on the structure side. And typically what you want to see with a dormer is 80 to 90% window and then the remaining percentage in structure. And that really brings out the best in a dormer. There's a couple builder tricks to this to make this work that a lot of builders have forgotten. For instance, you take a 2x4 wall, instead of putting it on the flat, you turn that 2x4 sideways, and then you really minimize the thickness of the wall here. And that's one trick that seems to have been forgotten. Here you see a lot more structure, and the dormer is not nearly as pleasing. This is probably more of a 60% structure, 40% window, where this is probably more 85-15, maybe 80-20% at the most. The roof pitch is more Greek Revival here. It's more of a 4-on-12. This is probably a little bit more of a 6 or 7. So by reducing the framing size, you're really minimizing the amount of structure you see by doing this. And this is one thing you saw done in New Orleans a lot, where they arched at the top of the sashes to fill in more of that structure with lights so that you saw less. And it was a real neat way to add some fanciful detail to the dormer and getting more lights and less structure to it. The next thing is that we brought the dormers more in. And because this roof was so wide and short, the dormers probably at the time on this elevation felt like they needed to spread out more. And when you bring the roof more in, the dormers want to come closer together to look more proportionate. And I'm going to take a guess here. A lot of designers will get hung up on the fact that things need to line up. And I'm sure in elevation this lined up, and it looks like what he did was he lined this window and dormer up with this column. In reality, when you're standing in front of the building, your eyes don't tend to line things like that up because of perspective. And you almost have to take into account that this roof is a different plane than the other pieces. And so if you look at just the roof and you want to space these dormers out, you sort of take away the rest of this. You make them look proportionate to the roof wherever it falls, and then that's on its own playing field. You should never let the fact that this dormer is not lining up with something below it dictate where it needs to go, especially if it looks better in the plane of the setting it's in. With that said, the columns were the next biggest thing sticking out to me that needed adjustment. And it looked to me as though these columns are probably closer to the Tuscan order. And when I say the Tuscan order, I'm discussing or talking about the proportion of the width to the height. And the Tuscan order is probably the lowest, more masculine of the orders, where it's more of a 1:6 ratio, meaning that if this was 1 foot wide, this would be 6 foot tall. If it was 2 foot wide, it would be 12 foot. 3 foot wide would be 18. I made these columns a little bit more narrow than what they are here. And in doing so, it makes these columns look a little bit on the fat, squatty side. This building, being as wide as it is, needs all the help it can get to give it more verticality. And I think a more slender column would have helped with that. This is probably more in the Doric order, maybe 1:8. They're about 6 inches less in diameter than what these are. And the other thing we did was we made the bases a little more substantial. They looked a little like they're missing something here, somewhat lackluster. I felt that was a good addition. The next items needing attention are the doors. First and foremost, these doors, they have more of a linear feel to them, which is in contrast with the short flat. And they don't exhibit the 3:5 ratio that you see in these classical traditional style buildings. I went back to what you saw in the original building and introduced or reintroduced the 3:5 ratio divided light French doors. And these are 10 light doors. So you have 10 lights here and 10 lights here. And then you have 4 lights in the transom. Where here you just have 4 and 4 and then 1 light. And the lack of muntins adds to a lack of scale, which just adds to the lack of beauty in the building. And these doors really look like they're maybe from a Home Depot or a lumber yard, maybe a special order item where these doors would have definitely been custom made on the job site, special ordered just for this particular building. And the next challenging part to fix on the building is the fact that the height of these doors seems very forced on this second level. And you can see here there's a bit of headroom between the transom and the ceiling, and then you're lacking that here. And you're really lacking it because the perspective from which this picture was taken, you can see that you're seeing the ceiling underneath, and from this low perspective you're really getting to see any bit of ceiling above that door, and the headroom is really lacking. When you get that scenario, the door feels forced within this particular area. Now you can see here, this is some shadowing drawn in here, but there's almost the same amount of room above the door here as there is here. And the way we accomplished that was by removing the transoms and the fan light above. I would think that if you had designed this building from new and scratch, you would want transoms and the segmented arch above the windows and doors for a house as grand as this. But being that we're using the same floor plan and not trying to change structure too much, it was better just to remove them. And that sort of plays into another trick that master builders will use, where it's actually called the hierarchy of fenestration. And the fenestration refers to the window placements. Whenever you get a building that's maybe 2 or 3 stories tall and you start placing the windows on the building, if you use the same size window as you go up, the windows at the top have a feeling that they're larger than the ones on the bottom. So the trick is that as you move up in the order, you make the windows slightly smaller than the one below it, and that helped address the feeling that the building was top heavy. And with that hierarchy in mind, these doors on the second level are slightly shorter than the ones below, and it works in this particular case. And same thing goes for the lights in the dormers. This is a 9/6 divided light dormer, and I'm not sure what to call this. This is just a 6 light, sort of lemon wedge Palladian arch type builder grade window. But the 9/6 really adds to the scale of the building, and it ties everything together. When they say a building sings, what they're really referring to is the fact that it's in harmony. This is in harmony with this, and this is in harmony with this. It's all playing together on the same sheet of music. Whereas you've got some different things going on here. You've got linear, you've got short and flat, you've got half round here, you've got segmented here. It's really not coming together. The last thing that I addressed was the handrail height. You can't see it too well there, but handrail height is somewhere about here. It's about halfway up the second level, and it just doesn't look proportionate. We went about a third of the way up. A lot of builders, experienced builders, especially in areas where you have codes, would argue that maybe this handrail is a bit short for code. There's a way to handle that. That would be a video in its own. There's some neat tricks on how to handle that. And this one actually is pretty close to where it needs to be code-wise anyway. That leads me into looking at the porches more closely. And the picture on the right is the original Oak Alley. And obviously the picture on the left is the new inspired building. And you can see here the handrail is just about halfway up on this very large wide column, and over here you can see where the column is not quite as wide. It's a little bit more proportionate with the height, and the handrail height is a little bit more than a third of the way up, but it's closer to a third than it is halfway. I'd say the other handrail is somewhere about this high, and you might say that it's only a few inches difference, but it makes a difference. The next thing that's glaring to me here is that the deck boards, the porch deck boards here, run in this direction, and they're tongue and groove. And when the rain blows, the wind blows the rain into the building, depending on the speed of the wind, it can get very high, and you can get a lot of buildup of water in here. The water can build up as high as 2 inches easily if you have a wind coming straight in and all the water's trying to drain out, and it just keeps building up and has nowhere to go. You want to pitch this porch very similar to a roof so that it drains without having too much pitch to where you have difficulty walking on an unlevel surface. And there's some new codes now with ADA. I think it's 2%, where you can't have more than a 2% grade, especially for like wheelchairs. But what really grabbed me, and you probably can't see it in your video there, these boards look to be running horizontal this way. And that is just one thing you don't do as either a designer or a builder on a porch. One might argue that we're using these new ASIC boards and they're guaranteed not to rot. It's not the ASIC boards that I'm worried about. It's the fact that the water can get into the cavity below. And I believe from the other pictures I saw there's a finished ceiling above on the first floor, which would be right below here, and you're going to trap water in there. When the water wants to drain out, instead of coming along the board like it does here, even here when it wants to fall into the tongue, it's still falling in this direction. And I'd say about, especially on the ASIC boards, 98% of the water gets out to the edge before it comes through the cracks. In this particular case, you're going to have a whole lot more water seep in between these boards and get into this cavity and cause problems to the structure underneath. Even if you built this structure out of treated lumber, it's not an environment you want to create just by saying, hey, I built it with the best materials. You want to use the best methods too. And this method is not the best method, especially when all you had to do was orient the beams in the other direction and bring the porch out this way. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this Oak Alley reproduction, and your thoughts on the comments and suggestions on the changes here, and looking forward to hear from you. Thanks.